going to cover a number of different rules. I'm going to be kind of just cover some of the specifics of them and not go into real great detail on most of them, but a couple of them I'll go into a little more detail on. And then Kip Studer is going to come up and he's going to give a little more detail about Senate Bill 150. So in the last couple of years, most of the regulations and authority for nutrient application have all come under the authority of the Ohio Department of Agriculture. There's three main divisions in the Department of Agriculture that have authority over nutrient application. Division of Plant Health has authority over the fertilizer application. Department of Livestock Environmental Permitting has authority over the large livestock operations and permitted farms. And the Division of Soil and Water Conservation has authority over the smaller farms as far as nutrient and sediment pollution. I'll start off with talking a little bit about the permitted farms and the large livestock operations. They're commonly referred to as concentrated animal feeding facilities. These large livestock operations are regulated, like I said, by the Division of Livestock Environmental Permitting. These facilities need a permit to operate, a PTO. They need a permit to install, or if they're going to make changes or expand, they need a permit to install. Some of these facilities, if they had a discharge, may also need an NPDES permit from the EPA. This just kind of gives some of the brief numbers of what size you would need to be to have one of those permits. I'm not going to read through all of them, but basically 700 mature dairy cows, 1,000 head of beef cows, or 2,500 finishing swine. So if you have more than that size operation, you need to have a permit. So this talk is mostly going to talk about some of the land application restrictions because that's some of the changes that have been happening over the last couple of years. A lot of those changes and new rules don't apply to the permitted farms because they already had to follow those restrictions. So they are not allowed to apply manure to frozen or snow-covered ground, and they never have been as far as they were permitted farms. Unless there's an emergency situation and they get special permission. If they have special permission, they have to follow some special guidelines as far as manure application. They also have to follow a rule that says they cannot apply if the weather forecast is saying there's greater than a 50% chance of a half inch of rain in a 24-hour period following their manure application. So they're required to print off those forecasts and keep track of that, make sure it's not going to rain. There's also a certified livestock manager part of the program. So all permitted facilities are required to have a certified livestock manager, or people who haul manure that are hauling more than 4,500 dry tons or 25 million gallons must be a certified livestock manager or have somebody in their operation. One of the new rules that came out a year or so ago says that anybody that's taking manure from a permitted livestock farm must either be a certified livestock manager or have gotten a certified fertilizer certificate, so gone through the new fertilizer application training. Okay, and switch gears into the Ag Pollution Abatement Program. Now this is an old program. It's been around since 1979. It's not a new program, and it really hasn't changed all that much over the years. These rules are enforced currently by the Ohio Department of Ag. It used to be the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, by the Division of Soil and Water, and by the local county soil and water offices. They apply to pretty much all livestock operations and agriculture operations, except for the ones that are covered under a permit. Under these rules, agriculture pollution basically means you're failing to use best management practices to avoid having pollution of the soil and waters of the state. These rules, the responsibility applies to about anybody. So it's if you own the livestock in Ohio, whether you have a large or small operation, these rules can apply to you. Whether you own or you just manage that cropland, these rules can apply to you. And if you're spreading manure, it can apply to you as the owner, operator, or the manure applicator. So depending on whose responsibility it is, you could be covered under these rules. So I'll briefly go through some of the rules and standards so you see what rules are in this program. One of the ones is overflow and discharge from animal waste storage. And treatment facilities, those are both holding ponds that have reached capacity and gone over capacity that we have worked with over the years. Some other rules are seepage from animal manure management facilities, other wastewaters, which would include like your milk house wastewater or your silage leachate water. Flooding from animal feeding operations, so if for some reason there was a flooding, it was built in the floodplain and the flood waters reached the operation. And composting of animal mortality, so the animal mortality compost areas or how you're handling your mortalities can be covered under these rules. Another one is manure contaminated runoff from feedlots and manure management facilities. So that's something that we try to abate by best management practices. You can't be running off into the ditch. And then our sediment rules. So we have sheet and rill erosion, gully erosion, wind erosion, and placing and sloughing. So our rules are based on complaints. So we investigate based on a complaint basis. So even though there is a lot of erosion out there, we don't often get complaints on them to investigate those. Land application of animal waste, that's a big one in Northwest Ohio where I'm primarily at. So I'll go into a little more detail on this one. So this rule, like I said, it can apply to each owner, operator, animal manure applicator, or person responsible for the manure application. And under this rule, you're required to follow the best management practices to minimize the pollution. And they have added, a few years ago, they added special requirements for watersheds in distress. And at this point, the only watershed in distress in Ohio is Grand Lake St. Mary's. It's been declared a watershed in distress, or designated one. So under those special watersheds in distress rules, they have their own set of regulations. They cannot apply manure between December 15th and March 1st. So it doesn't matter if it's frozen or not in that watershed, they can't apply during that time period. Outside of that time period, they're still not allowed to apply if it's frozen or snow covered, unless they can incorporate it within 24 hours or inject the manure. And they also have the same rule as the permanent operations, where they can't apply if the weather forecast says there's greater than a half inch of rain, or greater than 50% chance of a half inch of rain within 24 hours of application. So that kind of touches real briefly on the pollution abatement rules. Moving into Senate Bill 1. Senate Bill 1 is a new rule that came about just over a year ago. It had to do with concerns of manure application on frozen and snow-covered ground. Over the years, there's been quite a few incidents where we've had manure applied to frozen and snow-covered ground, and we've had some significant discharges into waters of the state that were hard to control. So for a number of reasons, the legislature came up with a rule, mostly to do with the algae problems in Lake Erie. So this is the rule. This is a field in Northwest Ohio where they were applying on frozen ground multiple days. As that started to thaw about a week later or 2 weeks later, we had some significant runoff coming off that field, going straight into the road ditch into a nearby creek several miles away. So that's some of the reasoning behind Senate Bill 1 and what they're trying to avoid. With this regulation, like I said, it became effective in 2015, but the rules weren't really finalized. We couldn't enforce it until last winter, so it's only been in place about a year. And this rule does not apply to the permitted farms because they already have to follow everything that's in this rule under their own regulations. This rule also touches, besides the land application part of it, it also touches on the dredging and disposal of dredge material and also some restrictions for wastewater treatment plants. I'm not going to get into too much detail on those. As well as the manure side of this rule, it also regulates fertilizer application on certain conditions. So this rule only applies to the Western Lake Erie Basin, and it is regulated under the Division of Soil and Water with help from the local soil and water offices. So these are the counties that are affected by this rule. It's not a statewide rule at this time. So it's just in the Western Basin. So the main restrictions in this rule say you shall not surface apply nutrients, so nutrients being fertilizer or manure, under the certain circumstances, one being on frozen or snow-covered ground, when the top 2 inches of soil are saturated from precipitation, or when the local forecast calls for then a greater than 50% chance of precipitation exceeding a ½ inch in 24-hour period for manure, or a 50% chance of over an inch in a 12-hour period for commercial fertilizer. It's just another example of some of the manure applications we see on frozen ground. This one happens to be on a cover crop field. Not that you can see it in that picture. One of the tools that's been developed that can help you comply with this regulation is the High-Nutrient Management Record Keeper, referred to as OnMark sometimes. This was paid for through a grant through several different agencies, including the Ohio Farm Bureau, Ohio State University, Muskegon Watershed, and Knox Soil and Water. It's a good app. You can put it on your phone. It allows you to look instantly at the weather forecast for your location and see what the chance of precipitation is. And it also has record-keeping pages in it where you can input your fields into there, and you can track your fertilizer or manure application in there, and it will keep those records for you along with your weather forecast if you put those nutrient applications into the record keeper. So there is a few exceptions to this rule that they put into the rule. So this rule does not apply if the manure or fertilizer can be injected into the ground. So even if it's frozen or saturated or snow covered, if it's injected, you're exempt from the rule. If it's incorporated within 24 hours, you're also exempt from the rule. Or if it's applied to a growing crop. So that means something that is still alive or will start growing again when the growing season starts again. So something like wheat or cereal rye. But something like oats that may winter kill, that may no longer be alive, would not be considered a growing crop. Yes?
So you're telling me that a cover crop in the middle of winter when the frost is 10 inches deep into the ground is an accepted practice?
That is what is put in the rule as an exemption. I'm not saying I recommend it. I strongly do not recommend it if you don't need to do it, because it isn't necessarily going to hold it if you have a lot of snowfall or something like that. And if it does run off, even if you're exempt from this rule, you can still be found in violation of the pollution abatement rule. So if you apply to a frozen snow-covered ground and it's not an emergency and you do have a discharge, you can still be found in violation of the pollution abatement rule, even though you're exempt from this rule. So this is a picture of example. I don't know how well it shows up in the back there. On this side, the right side, is just a picture of tire tracks. You can show it was pretty much frozen. Really wasn't sinking into the ground very much there, but it wasn't so frozen that he couldn't inject some liquid manure on this field. So it was one of the calls we got this winter. Somebody complaining on manure application on frozen ground. He was exempt from the rule. He was able to get pretty much all of it injected into the ground, and therefore he's exempt. Another manure application we had this winter, frozen and snow-covered ground on this field. Really no sign of cover crop. The landowner said he flew on some cereal rye late in the fall, really didn't get it to take at all. But he was able to go in, not within 24 hours, unfortunately, but he was going in about a week later. He was able to get it all incorporated before a rainfall event, so got it, the manure and fertilizer into the soil anyway. So hopefully we won't get erosion on the field. But another manure application, real small farm, just went out and did one pass around the field. Probably could have picked a better spot in the field away from the road ditch to spread the manure, but didn't apply a lot, but he did apply on a pretty good growing crop on that field. He had a good crop of cereal rye. So he was also exempt. These rules don't apply for stockpiling, so if you have solid manure, you are still allowed to stockpile on frozen or snow-covered ground. That's not considered application. There was a part in the rule that allowed you to apply for an exemption for up to the first 2 years. Medium operations could apply for one for the first year, which ended last July. Small operations can still apply for an exemption up through this July. After that, they'll be required to comply with the rule. So this, I believe, was put in there to help operations try to come into compliance and have some time to be able to put some manure storage or make some plans to come into compliance with this rule. This was a manure application onto a wheat field a few years ago. It's the same wheat field a week later. It's just really hard to control it if the ground's frozen and you get a big quick thaw. It all comes right off the edge of the field. Similar, just right down the road from that one on a wheat field. Under this rule, the director of the Department of Agriculture can also assess a civil penalty. That's something that DLAP has been able to do in the past. The Division of Soil and Water hasn't, so it's kind of new to our division. But minor penalties can be up to $2,000 a day per offense, and major can be up to $10,000 a day. And those are based on the amount of manure applied, how significant the problem was, and if there was a discharge to waters of the state. So those are where those penalties come in. Just another example of manure application we had that came in this winter. He was applying to this cornfield that isn't a cover crop. Those are just weeds in that field. It looks like a pretty good cover crop from a distance, but it's not. Put on a pretty light application on this field. As far as manure application goes, unfortunately, he had a wheat field between this field and the barn that he did not apply on, and he would have not been found in violation of the rule, but he chose to put it on the corn stalks, thinking it was a better location because it does have a lot of residue on that field. Unfortunately, it doesn't keep him exempt from the Senate Bill 1 violations. That's the same field. So kind of to recap some of these rules, and these restrictions for the different watersheds. So a watershed in distress, which is just Grand Lake St. Mary's, has restrictions December 15th through manure 1st for no manure application. And all three, both in the watersheds in distress, which is Grand Lake St. Mary's, the Western Lake Erie Basin, and for all permitted farms, none of them you can apply manure if they're calling for greater than a 50% chance of a half inch of rain in 24 hours. In the Western Basin, and for permitted farms, they can apply on frozen and snow-covered ground or in saturated ground. And for the Western Basin, we have the same restrictions for fertilizer as we do for manure, with the exception of the rainfall is greater than the 50% chance of an inch in 12 hours versus 24. This is one I'm just going to touch on real briefly. It's another new regulation that may apply to some of you. It's mostly for people who grow vegetables. So there is some vegetable farmers I know in Ohio. It's really getting at the problems we've had with foodborne illnesses. And I'm really going to touch on it mostly for the fact of the manure application side of it. But I just wanted to be, it's something you might want to be aware of if you do grow vegetables, I guess. So it's for the larger operations, not your little roadside stand that just sells a few vegetables beside the road there. It's if you have more than $25,000 in annual sales. For commodities, they're often consumed raw, so it's not just any vegetable. It's not for pumpkins and things like that. It doesn't apply to you, like I said, if you don't grow or handle raw produce, if you have less than $25,000 annual sales, if it's not something consumed raw, typically. If it's for personal or on-farm consumption, these rules don't apply. But there's a lot of new requirements as far as health and safety and sanitary, having sanitary equipment and water testing and health and hygiene training and that sort of thing on the farm. But the one I want to talk about a little bit most about, I guess, on this rule is it provides new guidelines for applying biological soil amendments such as raw manure and stabilized compost on vegetables. Right now, they're doing more research on it, trying to decide what standards they want to set, and conducting some risk assessment studies to see what they think the time frame should be between applying manuring and being able to harvest vegetables. Right now, they're using the organic program standards, which is a 120-day interval between application of manure and a crop in contact with the soil being harvested, or 90 days if the crop is not in contact with the soil. So just something that most of us aren't aware of, but another new regulation that's come out if you're a vegetable farmer. All right, so I talked about those rules. I'm going to have Kip come up next. Kip Studer is going to talk about Senate Bill 150, which is another new rule that is coming out. And
we're at that final point where we're almost done. So yesterday we listened to the keynote speaker, and he said, you have a job as a keynote speaker to do this, and get everyone pumped for this upcoming show. And now I'm the ending speaker, and I'm supposed to leave you with something before you go. So I'm going to leave you with something. I don't know what it is, but we'll figure it out here as we go. Maybe we'll have some questions. If you have a question, go ahead and ask it. But primarily I'm going to be talking about Senate Bill 150 and then voluntary nutrient management plans and how they pertain to Senate Bill 150. So Senate Bill 150 was signed into effect on September 30th, or it was put into effect in May of 2014. It will be effective September 30th, 2017, and that is the part about fertilizer certification. So it can be found under Ohio Revised Code 905. That's where it lies. It's pretty much still known as Senate Bill 150 in our shop, and throughout all the articles we continue reading, it's still getting called Senate Bill 150. I have a feeling it's going to be known as Senate Bill 150 for the time being. But what's in it? The fertilizer certification, that's the first thing. The ability for the Director of Ag to revoke or suspend powers if there are guys out there that aren't following the rules. Voluntary nutrient management plans, and it defines voluntary nutrient management plans, and I'll get into that more. The record-keeping requirements that go with fertilizer certification, and then finally the legal and civil defense against actions that could potentially be brought against you as long as you're following a nutrient management plan, the protections that Senate Bill 150 would provide. So the first one is the fertilizer certification. It applies to anyone who applies more than 50 acres of fertilizer. Starter is exempt, and I think and it is only looking at N and P. No, Senate Bill 1 only looks at N and P. But anyways, it set up for the Department of Ag to have a form and the process of going through a training session and so on, and us contracting it out with OSU Extension to do those trainings. And it set up the 3-year cycle for certification that goes along with your pesticide certification. And then the penalties if you're not following the rule. That's one thing we're having to get used to at the Department of Ag versus being at the Department of Natural Resources as we were previously. We're not regulators. People are changing their thoughts on seeing us because now we're kind of regulators, and we have the ability to assess fines when you're not following the rules, when we in the past have been more of a voluntary approach. So getting into this fertilizer certification, I'm sure many of you have attended. Can I get a raise of hands of who has their fertilizer certification? So a pretty good response. So we're doing pretty well. We have 12,566 people as of last week when I got the numbers. Each county is holding ones up until April, and then they will continue doing some throughout the summer. So there's plenty of opportunity just to get them if you do need it. The website there that I point out has stuff for every county, or it kind of breaks it into counties, 6 county districts or so, and places where you can go and get that training. It's a couple-hour certification course. You sit through it. You don't have to take a test yet or anything, but you have to go through it, and then you get your fertilizer certification. In the future, they're going to probably pair those with your pesticide application, so you can get your pesticide in the morning, get your fertilizer in the afternoon, or whatever works on their schedule, and that'll probably be ran through the OSU Extension like it currently is. As we've said in the past, most of the fertilizer certification and these rules will be enforced by Plant Health, not our division, but our division does kind of is going to kind of take the leading role in the nutrient management plans, whereas plant health will kind of cover the record keeping part of it and reviewing records if there are compliance issues. So as I said, being a regulator now, the director does have the ability to find the guys who aren't following the rules, and he's made it pretty clear to us, and he made it pretty clear at the conservation partnership meeting last week that if there's guys applying fertilizer without a certification, they could potentially go out there and stop them on the tractor and say, okay, provide me evidence that you're certified, well, after September 30th, but provide us evidence that you are, or we can fine you. So they've made it very clear to us that things could be changing and we might go after the bad actors. So what is a voluntary nutrient management plan? So when I was starting to do work on this slide or this presentation, I was sitting there looking at cartoons, and I was just having a tough time. And I finally found one that actually says nutrient management plan on it. And my coworker walked out and he goes, "What are you doing?" I said, "Looking for the perfect cartoon for this slide." And he goes, "Why don't you look up manure or something?" I said, "Yeah, type manure and cartoons, you can get some pretty good ones on there." So this was a pretty good one that I found, but that's kind of how some guys feel about nutrient management plans. When what is it there for, what is it going to do for me? So I did finally find one, but it took a little bit. As it points out, we're primarily looking at NP and K, the things that Tri-State has firm recommendations on. So the OSU workbook, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but many of the districts do have them. OSU has them. They are workbooklets, and they also have it available in electronic form that are, you go through it, it's more designed for a farmer to fill out, and it is technically a nutrient management plan. So a farmer could fill this out, take it to the board, their soil and water board, have it approved or disapproved. So this is the first thing that would fall under a voluntary nutrient management plan. The second one is a CNMP. Primarily when we're thinking of a CNMP, we're thinking of an animal producer, someone who's producing large quantities of manure or so on. So a CNMP is very specific, and that's where we're going to encourage people to go if they're creating a large amount of manure. We're going to tell them to do a CNMP. We're going to encourage that if they want to have a voluntary nutrient management plan. As I point out, we focus on livestock. They're very detailed. I just finished one. I think it was 220 pages. They're very detailed, and it's a large learning curve for the people who do write them. So you can reach out to NRCS if you want cost share, or also the technical service providers that are out there. Then the final one is a document that is equivalent to a plan specified in a form approved by the director or the director's designee. So the director, we had this written into law in 2014. We had to develop this form. So this is the form that we came up to. It came up with, this is an Excel spreadsheet that we put together, and more or less we are identifying the sources of nutrients, identifying yields, average goals, etc., and then putting it together into a nutrient management plan. So what's required in those plans? So the first thing is soil tests not older than 3 years. The method is noted, the seasonal time, the utilization, and the application of nutrients are all documented. We're identifying manure, fertilizer, waste, any nutrients that might be put out on that field, we're identifying them in that plan, and they're being accounted for. Final thing is the location of the farm, spreadable acres, the crops grown, actual and projected yields. So any person can get a nutrient management plan. They can write one themselves. They can request the district to write them. They can request another person to write that for them. And they can also, they can also ask the district of their local soil and water board to write one also. It is the responsibility of the local soil and waters to either approve or disapprove that plan. So if a producer wants a plan written, has one written for them, takes it to their soil and water board, it's their job to either approve it or disapprove it. If they disapprove it, they have to tell the farmer it was disproved. He can take that to the Franklin Common Pleas Court in Columbus and appeal it, or he can do a little work on it and resubmit it back to that district. So as the soil and water staff and our division of soil and water conservation, we went out to the districts. We knew there was kind of a learning curve and there was a need for some training. So we provided 5 trainings across the state, and we trained 134 NRCS and SWCD staff on some of the things that we needed to cover. So the basics of reading a soil test, the basics of tri-state. How do we make a recommendation based on tri-state, learning the actual formula in tri-state, so we have some background on it. And then nutrient management planning. How do we sit down with a farmer and decide when, where, and how they're going to apply their nutrients? So a lot of districts do not have this staff. Some people may go to a district board and say, we just don't have anyone on staff who can write this. We can't do this. Well, then they maybe can contact us and we can help them get through this, or we can go back to our NRCS partners and let them help them use the tools that are available for them. So record keeping. I don't know if you can read it, but it says, as part of our commitment to going green, we're now using real beans for doing our counting. My uncle was an accountant. He always called himself a bean counter. I married a CPA, so she's a bean counter. So I looked up the definition of a bean counter. So it says an accountant or a bureaucrat. My wife falls into the one category. I guess I kind of fall in the other. But it was basically a derogatory term. Well, I never really took it as a derogatory term when my uncle called himself it, but I kind of laugh about it. But the main thing is we're now going to have to become better record keepers. So that is going to be the big thing that is going to protect a lot of people, is the record keeping. So all fertilizer certificate holders shall maintain fertilizer records for 3 years. And then they also must document them within 24 hours of application. So there's 11 things that must be documented after you make a fertilizer application and any nutrient application, actually. So the date, place, rate, analysis, who applied it, the name of the certificate holder, if you're the application holder and your son or daughter or a farmhand goes out and applies it, that whoever the certificate holder that you're applying under, it has to be documented. The soil conditions, type of application, weather conditions. This gets into what Jocelyn was talking about, like the Senate Bill 1 rules, was there predicted rain in the forecast, and so on. And then whether the land was frozen or not on there. So those are the 11 things that need to be on the records. So that's kind of where we're at. If you have your ag retailer apply them, they have to supply you those records within 30 days. You can see that on the 3rd bullet point. All the fertilizer records. So if going back to the other thing of if you're a farmhand or someone applies for you, they have to provide you the records within 10 days, and then you must maintain them for 3 years. As I've said before, plant health will be the one that will be reviewing these records. So it won't be me, it will be plant health. So if you have specific questions on the record keeping, you need to contact Matt Bealshop at Plant Health, but they can answer your questions. And then the final thing is the Director of Ag or his designee has the ability to review those records at any time. So affirmative defense. When you see affirmative defense, you're thinking, oh, who's going to sue me for applying fertilizer? That's probably what the people in Iowa were thinking over the last couple of years previous. Who's going to sue me over fertilizer applications? Well, they're living it right now, and they're seeing that someone's trying to sue them over applying nutrients. So this is pretty much all we have to offer with these plans, as that protection against civil litigation. But the biggest thing it's going to come down to is you making sure you have the records. Because if you don't maintain the records, that plan isn't going to help you out at all. So like I said, the records are going to be the the primary component of that, and then that's about it. So what's the benefit of a voluntary nutrient management plan? First one would be the affirmative defense, which it is what it is. It'll be interesting to see if we ever have to use that against that protection or not. The other one is to compare ag retailers' recommendations. For the most part, up here in Northwest Ohio, most every ag retailer is running Tri-State for their recommendations, but we still do see some out there that aren't following Tri-State. So one benefit would just be to see, are they running Tri-State and so on. And then it also gives our districts the opportunity to talk to producers and people within their county who may want to discuss nutrient management. So I think we've really educated our district staff, and hopefully we can provide that asset to the community members to talk knowledgeably about nutrients. I know we have a lot of guys out there who probably know more than I do, but you would never know it talking to them until you start discussing it. So there are some good resources for guys out at the soil and water districts. I'm not saying every district has a CCA on staff, but there are some guys out there that can help you out and lead you in the right direction if not. So final thing is our voluntary nutrient management plan in our spreadsheet does not meet 590 requirements, so this won't be something you can do to meet NRCS EQIP payments. So currently it does not meet that requirement. So just quickly getting into this, I would had I had some more time, I probably would have just got out the Excel spreadsheet and ran it for you. But seeing that my computer is a USB drive, I'm not going to be able to do that today. I'll kind of point out some things. So at the top, it's just basically getting the field information, the producer information, some of that background information that we need for record keeping. The second one is actually your soil test results. So all you do is you put a weighted field average in those soil tests. You pick the next set of boxes is you pick your crops, your yields, and it tells you Tri-State recommendation. It tells you to the closest pound what your recommendation should be. The next thing is you pick your crops and you start doing your nutrient management planning. You pick your different products. I think I found 8 different common products: DAP, BAP, 1034O, 28, ammonium anhydrous, and so on. Pick those products and then you start punching in your rate. Are you looking at a 1-year application, a 2-year application? And then you got to do a little math by yourself to figure out what rates will be. So that's the large portion of it. Over here on the bottom, I do have a little spot for you to put in some custom fertilizers. So you have a special blend that you use, or you do have some chicken litter that you put on 1 ton on X amount of X field. We do have the ability to put in that if we know the analysis for that product. So if you are a large manure producer, we're not going to encourage you to use this. This sheet does not take into account on nitrogen availability, and it doesn't make any of the assumptions on that. But if you were doing a ton or 2 tons of poultry litter a year, we can punch some numbers in and get a decent idea on phosphorus availability and so on. So it does have that in there, and then there's a product summary. So based on the products you pick and when you're applying them, it'll give you an amount for the 3 years of the plan. And then there's an area for some notes down at the bottom just to document some other things that may be different or assumptions you made or so on. So that is pretty much it. This is ODA's form for a nutrient management plan. So we have actually 2 different sheets that we're going to use. We know that retailers do a very good job of making nice maps for us, easy to read, variable rate maps. So we want to utilize that also. So I'll show you here in a second the second part of our nutrient management plan. So this would be the front side of your sheet of paper. On the back for that field is your record keeping sheet. So we hope that 1 sheet of paper, that's your nutrient management plan for that field. We figured when we look at a CNMP that's 220 pages and know a lot of people put them up there on the shelf and never actually look at them, that's kind of a sick feeling when you spend 80 hours working on it. We hope that we made something here that producers could actually staple on the front of their papers or their ag retailer papers and actually provide them something that they can look at, something they can review, and so on. As I said earlier, we get these great maps from our ag retailers. They're an awesome asset to the producers. They show us what we need. They give us a lot of the information that we need to call it a nutrient management plan. Yield goals. What crops are they targeting? How many acres are they spreading on? The things that we need. So with this in mind, we developed a second part to the spreadsheet, and this is the VRT review tool. So the idea was, let's take those things the ag retailers are providing us, and let's document the handful of other things that they may not have on there. So they may not have the seasonal time of application, or they may not have, what's the other one? Whether it was incorporated or something. So let's document these things so we can call it a nutrient management plan. So it looks very similar to the other one, but there's some slight differences. So the idea behind it was, we take it, we punch in soil tests from 3 different locations on the field. So a high soil test, a low soil test, and probably something in the middle to see where their recommendation is turning on and turning off based on the formula they're using in whatever SMS, map shots, or whatever the program they're using to make recommendations. So what this is designed to do is you punch in the soil tests, you pick their yield goals, and then it throws up a number based on what Tri-State says on the soil test, and the crop yield, and the yield goal, the crop. And so then it says, okay, if we are applying DAP, it should be this amount on that spot in the field. So it's kind of hard to visualize without seeing it, but it'll tell you the recommendation, so you got to look at the map and say, okay, they're recommending this amount of product in that spot of the field. Yep, they match Tri-State, or no, they're way off. So down below that, there's a handful of things that may not have been on the, a lot of those ag retailer maps don't have some of the other things, so there's some questions down there. So we can document areas that may be lacking, so we can take credit for that as a nutrient management plan. There's just some other spots for notes, comments, etc. So I do have one example up here. So through one of our programs, our Great Lakes Restoration Initiative program, we were paying for soil testing, precision soil testing, and reviewing it and then the ag retailers were providing us Tri-State recommendations. I received one, and I started looking at it, started reviewing it, and some jumped out at me, and this isn't following Tri-State, so I kind of did longhand and started doing the calculations, or I think I pulled up the OSU spreadsheet and started looking at the numbers and saying, well, based on I don't know if you're going to be able to see it or not, but based on the numbers there, we should only be applying phosphorus fertilizers in the 2 spots. So I think it's 18 parts per million, Brapy 1, and 36 parts per million. So probably not applying much fertilizer on this field. So if we look at those 2 spots, in the top left I think is 1, and in the bottom left is 3. If you correspond those to the soil tests, those are the only 2 spots that should be receiving fertilizer. So things like this were in my mind when we were working on the spreadsheet, saying, okay, we need something quick, easy, that we can punch in a soil test and it tells us what it should be. So I know that looking at this soil test, there's only going to be 2 spots in this field where it's going to need fertilizer. So the map on the bottom was the original map I received. And I'm going, something's not right here. We should only have 2 spots with fertilizer being called for on this map. So I called the ag retailer, and he said, well, yeah, that must have been a mistake. They applied the wrong recommendation to that field. So I said, can you get me a new map? Within 20 minutes, they mailed me a new map and said that they would get it out to the producer, so he had the right map in hand. But we have this, ag retailers have this ability to process this very quickly. I see most of them doing Tri-State, but sometimes a new guy or they get a new program and they aren't making Tri-State recommendations. So that's one thing that the farmers need to look at is, are they following Tri-State? Most of the programs, all our programs require that they follow Tri-State. So that just a quick comparison of those 2 fields. So the ag retailers' first recommendations are on the left, Tri-States are on the right. So you can see that even their minimum rate, they were still applying 44 pounds of product, even at their lowest rate, versus Tri-State, which it says 0.039 pounds, but that should just be 0. The average rate, so 63 pounds versus 11 pounds. Total product versus Tri-State's recommendation, so about 1.5 tons extra product on that field. The big one is the amount of acres spread. So if you were paying application rate per acre, you might receive a much larger bill because they spread a lot more acres on that farm. So those are just kind of something I thought of or just really jump out, and I think that's something that farmers can really utilize, just reviewing their records, make sure they understand it to know what exactly they're looking at. The final note would be the limitations of the spreader. So if you're not familiar with variable rate spreaders, they need a certain amount of fertilizer before they can adjust products. So some rag retailers might say, if it's under 100 pounds, we can't spread it. That's our minimum rate. So it's either 0 or 100 pounds. So that's something to think about when you're looking at these maps, is the limitations of their spreaders and what they're putting out there. Do you have a question?
Yes. What happens, I mean, you're doing variable rate and you have the soil test showing there, but if you're, well, I guess two questions. If you're injecting phosphorus in the soil, not and you're doing it with your own equipment and you don't have variable rate technology, but so there's some responses that should be applied, but you can't adjust it. What happens there? I mean,
So you have the variable, or you're getting the very precise soil test, but you don't have the ability to spread to that. There's nothing we can do. I mean, in your case, that would probably be like an average soil test. So you take the average soil test. All of them are going to be case by case basis, where if you have the technology to do a variable rate application, yes, that's great. But we know that a lot of guys, they get a soil test and they're not using the data. They're just going out, well, let's spread what we did last year. Or does that kind of answer your question?
Also, since it's injected in the ground, is it as sensitive to the...
We would still encourage you to use Tri-State. There's a lot of science behind Tri-State, but if you don't have the ability to put it in the ground, I guess we would encourage you to put it in the ground, but there may not. You have to go by with what you have, I guess, and what's the best practices you can put out there on the farm.
It basically comes down to how many acres you're doing that you're going to be putting fertilizer on that you don't need. That cost compared to how much it costs to have the variable rate equipment. So if you're running 50 acres of corn a year, yeah, don't worry about it.
Yeah, it's not gonna benefit it. You hear a lot of guys saying, well, why did you get the variable rate soil test done if you weren't going to spread it? If you're just going to spread 100 pounds no matter what, are you throwing money out the door, or is it good knowing? I guess that's where you have to weigh it. Is it worth having the precise soil test if you're not going to use it? Right, and yeah, there's a lot of benefits to following Tri-State on a variable rate idea. Probably the biggest one is the cost savings. I guess it'd be worth looking at the cost savings. Is it worth it? Are you seeing a yield? You're going to have to do that, the analysis there to decide, is it really paying for itself? Most guys say variable rate lime is going to pay for itself no matter what, and that's where they see their biggest cost savings, and that's why they start with variable rate lime, and then they move to P once they feel comfortable with it, and so on. So, and with that, I think we're done. Do you have any more questions that you thought of as we were going on? Yep.
So with the voluntary defense, I've seen a lot of interest with non-field stores in the conservation districts. Sorry. Have you seen a lot of interest with the voluntary nutrient management plans being submitted?
No, I've actually only looked at one that a district has done, and they were doing it for another grant that they said that they would do voluntary nutrient management plans. We knew going into this may not be something that farmers really want, but we wanted to prepare our soil and water districts, so if guys do start coming in, we have someone on staff that can help them, or they know who to contact to help them. We don't want to be sitting there and saying, oh, well, we didn't even think of that. So we just wanted to try to stay in front of it and try to prepare our employees to be able to address it.